You could just grab any bag of indoor potting soil that you see, but you do run the risk of giving your plants root rot. Let me take you through what you need to select the best soil for your indoor plants. Hey, Lee here, helping you become a better plant parent. Selecting the right kind of soil for your indoor plants can be a daunting task, especially when you Google what type of soil your plant might need and it says well-draining soil. Well, what exactly does that mean? I'm going to take you through some of the different soils that I use and answer some common questions that you might have about soil. Chapters are down in the description, so you can click to any part that you may find interesting. If you want to oversimplify things, soil basically does two things. First, it feeds plants nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Secondly, it retains water. The problem is that when your plant retains too much water, that can cause your plant's roots to start rotting. Plants do need a wet and dry cycle, so it's important that your plants have the ability to dry out. The issue with some potting soil is that it's dense. It does such a good job at retaining moisture that it can overwater some plants. To help potting soils become less dense, you'll find little white pieces inside your store-bought potting soil, and this is perlite. Perlite is superheated volcanic glass. When it reaches a certain temperature, it pops and becomes these white pieces. Perlite helps soil drain more quickly, but it also does retain water. There are some important things that you should know about perlite. The dust that comes from perlite can irritate your lungs, so please be careful when you're using it. If you make your perlite wet, that will stop the dust from rising up into the air. Mixing perlite and potting soil is a great choice for most indoor houseplants, but because perlite is so light, eventually the perlite pieces will rise to the top of your pot. One soil type that I use all the time is orchid bark. While the type of tree may vary depending on what brand you use, orchid bark is basically just tree bark that you can include in your potting mix. By adding bark to your mix, you can increase the drainage in your soil. Bark does retain some moisture, but because of the size and shape, it is extremely well draining. There are plants in the wild called epiphytes. They put out special aerial roots that help them attach onto trees as they climb higher to reach higher lights. They are used to water draining through them more quickly, and orchid bark can definitely help with that. If you have a cactus, aloe, or a succulent like a jade plant, then cactus soil is a must-have. A combination of potting soil, sand, and gravel, this mix is designed for supporting the root system of plants that live in deserts and other arid environments. Usually, these plants have thinner root systems and water retention is not something that you want. If you have succulents, cactus soil is a must, but this soil can also be really beneficial if you have something like a snake plant or Dracaena. There are many other soils that you can probably get away with not using. For example, peat moss and vermiculite are really great at retaining moisture. If you're strictly growing indoor houseplants, you may not need them, but if you're doing something like germinating seeds, or if you have a calathea or a peace lily that prefers to be wet most of the time, then this might be useful for you, but to keep things simple, you probably won't need them. Horticultural charcoal is another great product that can help you with drainage, and it can release water and fertilizer more evenly throughout your plant. However, it can be harder to find, and I would only recommend this if you're growing more uncommon and expensive houseplants. Pumice is made from superheating volcanic rock. Similar to perlite, it does help with drainage, and it's much heavier than perlite. While pumice does work better than perlite in terms of making your plant drain faster, it is much more expensive and a lot more challenging to find. Coco coir is made from coconuts and can come in many different forms, from coconut husks in chunks, hairs, or finer ground soil. This retains moisture really well. It's often used as a medium to propagate plants, and it is well draining. This is harder to find and probably not necessary for most cases. You can't have a best soil mix without first considering what type of plant you have. The best mix for a croton is probably going to be the worst mix for a succulent. Here's how I go about selecting my best soil mixes. Start with a container and slowly fill it in with things that make your soil more well draining. For example, your orchid bark, your perlite, horticultural charcoal, and coconut husks. From here, you'll have a baseline of how you want to make your other types of soils. Let's think about a croton. While it can survive with a dense potting soil mix, it will really benefit from adding more well-draining materials. Here's what you can do. I have to repot this croton and I want to upgrade its pot size. Since I know this plant can do well with a typical potting soil, I'll start with a mix of mostly potting soil, about 2/3. I'll grab that from my bag and I want to fill in the rest with materials from my well-draining mix. Now that I have the ratio of soils I'll need, I can mix my materials to create my perfect soil. What about a Dracaena or a snake plant? Most sources recommend an extremely well-draining soil and usually go for under half of that mix being potting soil. So for a typical Dracaena or snake plant mix, you could consider starting with 1 part potting soil, 1 part of your well-draining materials, and 1 part cactus soil. Having this pre-made mix of well-draining soils really speeds up the process. Make sure that you're storing it in a cool, dark place and keep it sealed tightly. If you're thinking about making mixes for your succulents, I would avoid using big pieces like orchid bark. Just stick with cactus soil and perlite or pumice. Cactus and succulents generally have thinner roots, so I do think that having big pieces of orchid bark can impede their growth. So you can just pick it out like the disgusting pieces of green bell peppers on your pizza. When thinking about changing your soil, it isn't always about the soil itself. First, we have to focus on root growth. As your plant grows, your roots start to fill out your pot. If you want your plant to grow more, you do need to create more space for those roots to spread out. Most plants require repotting once a year, and as they grow larger, they might need repotting every 2 years. But once your plant starts to reach its maximum height, it may not require repotting at all. This is when you can start thinking about changing your soil for the soil's sake. As your plant continues to grow, the nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in your soil will continue to get depleted. As your plant grows, it will continue to use up these nutrients, and it's your job to replenish them. I would recommend replenishing your soil at least every 2 years. And remember that nutrient loss can be mitigated by fertilizing your plant, but even with new soil, please consider that you should still be fertilizing your plant throughout the growing season. When you're thinking about topping up the soil on your indoor plant, my answer is generally no. If you're repotting your plant every 1 to 2 years, this shouldn't be an issue. However, it may be the case that you have a plant that's so enormous, the pot is so big that you can't actually repot it. In that case, topping up your soil is essential. You can also think about putting in slow release fertilizer to help mitigate some of that nutrient loss. If you do have a plant that big, I would love to hear about it in the comments down below. Can you reuse old soil? You can, but would you want to? Let's talk about that. First, consider this. Could your soil have any pests? If the answer is yes, then you literally have to bake your soil at a low temperature in order to kill any eggs and larvae from those pests. Spread it out on a baking sheet, cook it for over an hour at the lowest temperature, and make sure to let it cool before you handle it again. After you finish baking your soil, you do have to replenish the nutrients. You can add slow release fertilizer to your soil to replenish the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but without an actual way to measure how much of those materials are in your soil, there's no way to find out what is the appropriate amount to add depending on how much soil you're using. Cooking your soil will also destroy its biological health, eliminating any healthy microbes that contribute to the overall health of your soil. So if you do that, you'll have to add additional products like humic or fulvic acid, as well as increasing your soil biology by adding rhizospheric or endophytic microbes to your soil. If you're looking for better soil health in general, you can consider some of the products that I use. Affiliate links are down in the description. Now that we know much more about soil, and we know some of the best soil mixes to use on our plants, the next question we have to ask ourselves is, should we be switching to the best soil? Maybe not. We do still need to consider transplant shock. Changing your soil type so drastically can have a negative effect on your plant and might put it into shock. Let's talk about the fiddleleaf fig, a plant that is extremely sensitive to change. Let's pretend that we have a fiddleleaf fig that's doing pretty well in pure potting soil, a soil type that's not going to be really great for the plant. If we go out and change that soil to a well-draining mix adding all the best materials to make the perfect mix for that plant, the shock from going to pure potting soil to a well-draining soil mix could actually kill this plant. Oh, that's the name of the channel. The goal should be to get to our most desired soil mix. For example, if your plant is in 100% potting soil, the first time you repot, maybe we'll have 75% potting soil, the rest with well-draining soil. The mix after that will go to 50%, then to 25% until we have the most perfect soil mix for that plant. And of course, this may not apply to all plants, especially hardy plants like a pothos, where you can pretty much put them in anything you want and they'll survive. I've noticed that more and more stores are selling their own pre-mixed bags of soil mixes. Should you be buying these? Let's talk about that. It's absolutely going to be cheaper to buy your own materials and start mixing your own soil in the long run, especially if you have a lot of plants. If you have larger plants, it'll probably take several bags of these pre-mixed soils to actually be able to change it. However, if you only have a few plants, you don't have a lot of storage, and you're not ready to make the investment into mixing your own soil, then this might be the choice for you. But again, you can do whatever you want. I'm not your dad. If you have the means, please support your local small business. These soil mixes are usually priced to produce more profits than selling the plants themselves. So if you are buying them from your local small businesses, they do really go a long way to help. Like the video if it was helpful, and consider subscribing. See you next time.